Hello and welcome. I'm Exolite and this is my channel. Today we're going to talk about the legend of Marjorie McCall. Very interesting. Before we get started, if you would please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you are not subscribed. Totally free. Really helps my channel to be seen. And I have a new Etsy store. I'm going to give the link below. If you're interested, take a look around. All right, here we go. Times were really hard in the 1700s, and people made money wherever and however they could. Although there was one way that was particularly frowned upon, and this one was known as a resurrectionist, also known as a grave robber or a sack-em-up. These unsavory type of people provided cadavers to the many private medical schools throughout the UK, and at the start of the 18th century, business was booming. Probably the most famous of these grave robbers were Burke and Hare. They found infamy almost 100 years later. Their notoriety wasn't really due to their grave robbing so much, but more to do with their fresh supply of corpses. They were both originally from Ireland. They met in Edinburgh, from where they went on to supply students of anatomy with more than their quota of cadavers. Grave robbing, or resurrectionists, weren't unique to Edinburgh. In Ireland, surgeons were paying a nice amount of money for the newly deceased, and this provided employment opportunities for the local resurrectionists. This practice was, however, to prove a hair-raising experience for one such band of grave robbers in Lurgan in 1705. Marjorie McCall was married to a doctor. They lived in Church Place, Lurgan, and by all accounts, they were really, really happy. Then Marjorie fell ill. Her husband John was beside himself with worry. In the early 1700s, many illnesses that we consider minor today could be fatal, and the quote, fever was a catch-all for many of these ailments. Sadly, Marjorie succumbed to her bout of fever, and she was buried in McCALL Church in Ireland Cemetery, not far from her home in Church Place. She was hastily buried for the fear of the fever spreading, and that should have been the end of that. But she was become one of the most famous women in Lurgan, and is still talked about to this day. There was a lot of commotion at the wake, and it was concerning a valuable ring that Marjorie was wearing. Many of the mourners tried in vain to actually pry it from her fingers, perhaps because they anticipated the possibility that grave robbers would desecrate Marjorie's resting place in order to steal that ring. Marjorie was buried, still wearing her beautiful gold wedding ring. Due to her husband's inability to remove it from her finger, which had swollen considerably since her death, but the news of the treasure leaked out to the resurrectionists. They spotted the opportunity to gain themselves, well, a little bonus. After the wake, which, by the way, was a tradition to attempt to avoid premature burial, as the family of the deceased would sit over the body and watch it for several days to make sure that the person did not wake up. Marjorie was duly interred in McCALL graveyard. That evening, before the soil even had time to settle on Marjorie's coffin, the grave robbers paid a visit Working under the cover of darkness, they dug into the dirt until they reached and opened her coffin, and, true to the rumor, the ring was still on her finger. But before removing the body, they attempted to steal the valuable item, but it would not budge. Being businessmen and all, they weren't about to allow such a prize to make its way just to a surgeon's slab. And since she couldn't get any more deader, they agreed that they were going to go ahead and cut off her finger and get that ring. And then they got the shock of their lives. As soon as blood was drawn from Marjorie, she came to, revived from the coma-like state, or sometimes they called it a swoon, she had fallen into. She sat bolt upright, her eyes were wide, and she began screaming like a banshee. There are differing reports as to the fate of the body snatchers. One states that one of the men dropped dead on the spot from fright. The other that they both ran for their lives, never to resume their dubious occupation again. Whatever the truth is, what matters is it's pretty certain that they'd never forget that little misadventure. The bold Marjorie helped herself out of the ground and stumbled the short distance to her home. As it turned out, there were actually scratch marks on the lid of her coffin. When she was at home, her husband John was sitting with their children and relatives, being sad about her passing and toasting her journey to a better place, when the door was knocked on 3 times. John, still racked with grief, exclaimed, "If your mother was still alive, I'd swear that was her knock." And sure enough, when he opened the door, John was confronted by his, quote, late wife, dressed in her burial clothes, dripping from her almost severed finger, but very, very much alive. John's response is disputed, but most tellings of the story agree that he dropped dead on that floor. Now, there's a quandary: joy and sadness in equal measure for the rest of the family. Marjorie was alive and relatively well, but John was more dead than Marjorie ever had been. He was buried in the plot that Marjorie had recently vacated. Marjorie went on to remarry and have several more children, although it was rumored that she left the grave pregnant by a, quote, unspecified suitor. When she did finally die, she was returned to Shankill Graveyard, and to this day her gravestone still stands, and it bears this inscription: "Lived once, buried twice." She is still remembered by townspeople to this day, and it's said that sometimes she can be seen wandering Shankill Cemetery, perhaps looking for those who had wronged her. Thank you for coming to my channel, and good night.